So it has quite a prominent brow, and the cheeks are incredibly flat, and they flare out to the sides of the face as they curve around the skull. And when we put them together, we see that it has this massive jaw, that the two jaws together sit well forward of the face, and that's really unusual. Certainly for a modern human, it's a very ancient feature.
In 2022, scientists opened the skull of a 4,000-year-old woman and found a genetic signature that didn't belong in Asia at all. Buried deep in a cave in southern China, she should have fit neatly into the story of early Asian populations.
A thigh bone found in China suggests an ancient human species thought to be extinct about 1.5 million years ago survived alongside modern humans.
Instead, her DNA pointed across the planet directly to the first ancestors of Native Americans. For decades, researchers argued over who she was, a lost human lineage, a hybrid, a mistake in the record. Now, with modern genetic analysis and a new understanding of ancient migration routes, that debate has come to an abrupt end. This isn't just a breakthrough in DNA science. It's a challenge to everything we thought we knew about how humans moved, survived, and spread across the world. Today, we're stepping inside that cave and uncovering why one woman from the Ice Age is forcing scientists to redraw the map of human history. The cave that time forgot. Deep in Yunnan province, in the southwestern corner of China, the land rises into steep mountains covered with thick, wet forests. Rivers twist through valleys carved over millions of years. The air hangs heavy with moisture, and life grows everywhere you look.
14,500 years ago, southwest China was released from the grip of the Ice Age and filled with lush forested basins teeming with life.
This is not the kind of place where ancient things survive. Heat and humidity destroy organic material. Bones decay. DNA falls apart into useless fragments. If you wanted to preserve something for thousands of years, this would be the worst possible location on Earth. And yet, hidden inside one of these mountains, scientists found something that changed everything. The cave is called Red Deer Cave, named after the massive number of giant deer bones scattered across its floor. When researchers first entered in 1989, they found layers upon layers of ash, dirt, and animal remains. Ancient people had lived here. They had cooked here, eaten here, survived here for generations. The bones of the red deer showed cut marks from stone tools and burn marks from cooking fires.
The 14,000-year-old bone found among the remains of China's Red Deer Cave people belongs to a species resembling the most ancient humans, and the discovery was made by a joint team of Australian and Chinese scientists.
This was a home, a place where families gathered around flames and shared meals, while the world outside remained wild and dangerous. As the team dug deeper through the layers of sediment, they uncovered something unexpected. Mixed among the animal bones were fragments of a human skeleton. A skull cap emerged from the dirt, and the moment the scientists held it in their hands, they knew something was wrong. The skull did not look right. It did not match any known population from the region. The brow ridge was thick and heavy, almost primitive. The skull itself seemed too wide, the jaw too strong and deep. The nose opening appeared broader than it should have been for a modern human. Every feature pointed toward something older, something that should have disappeared from Earth tens of thousands of years earlier. The researchers labeled the skull Mengzi Ren, and they stepped back to consider what they had found. Had they just discovered a new species of human? Had some ancient lineage survived in these remote forests long after the rest of their kind vanished? The questions multiplied, but answers remained out of reach. The skull went into a museum collection, and for the next 3 decades, it sat there like a puzzle nobody could solve. Scientists from different camps formed different theories. Some believed the skull belonged to a surviving pocket of archaic humans, perhaps relatives of the Denisovans, who were known to have lived somewhere in Asia. Others argued the woman was a hybrid, the child of a union between modern humans and some unknown ancient group. A few suggested the skull simply represented natural variation within our own species, that ancient humans looked far more different from each other than people do today. The debate circled and circled without resolution. Nobody had enough evidence to prove anything. And then, after 30 years of waiting, technology finally caught up with the mystery. Cracking the genetic code. For 30 years, the skull of Mengzi Ren sat in a museum collection like a locked safe that nobody had the key to open. Scientists knew something important was hidden inside those ancient bones, but they lacked the tools to access it. The debates continued, the theories multiplied, and the mystery deepened with each passing year. That finally changed in 2018, when a team of Chinese scientists decided to attempt what everyone told them was impossible. They would try to extract DNA from a skull that had spent 14,000 years in one of the worst environments imaginable for genetic preservation. This was not like working with remains from Siberia, where frozen permafrost kept genetic material intact for tens of thousands of years. Yunnan province was the opposite of Siberia in every possible way. The climate was warm, humid, and saturated with moisture. These conditions worked like an engine of destruction, breaking apart the delicate molecular chains of DNA with relentless efficiency. Every expert the team consulted told them the same thing. It was pointless to try. The skull was too old, the environment too hostile, the odds too long. The team listened to these warnings and decided to proceed anyway. They focused their efforts on a specific part of the skull called the petrous bone, a dense mass of tissue buried deep inside the inner ear. This bone acts like a natural fortress, one of the hardest structures in the human body. If any DNA had survived inside the skull of Mengzi Ren, this was where they would find it. The drilling process required extraordinary precision. The researchers worked in sterile rooms, wearing full protective equipment, using cold processing methods to prevent further damage to fragile genetic material. A single flake of skin from a researcher, a single breath exhaled too close to the sample, could corrupt the results and make ancient DNA impossible to distinguish from modern contamination. The extraction process took years. When the team finally isolated genetic material from the petrous bone, they found heavily degraded fragments mixed with contamination from soil, bacteria, and thousands of years of environmental exposure. Sifting through this genetic noise was like searching for specific grains of sand scattered across an entire beach. The final result added up to less than 1% of the complete genome. In most circumstances, such a tiny fraction would be considered a failure. But the team had extracted enough to answer the questions that had haunted researchers for 3 decades. The DNA proved beyond any doubt that Mengzi Ren was not a new species. She was not a hybrid between modern humans and some archaic group like the Denisovans. She was fully and completely Homo sapiens, as human as anyone walking the earth today. The primitive features that had confused scientists for so long turned out to be nothing more than natural variation within our own species. Ancient human populations carried far more physical diversity than modern groups. One mystery was solved, but the DNA had just begun to reveal its secrets, and what came next would prove far more significant than anyone expected. The impossible connection. The researchers examined the mitochondrial DNA first, the genetic material passed down only through mothers. Mengzi Ren carried a lineage called R9C, a branch that no longer exists anywhere in mainland Asia. Her maternal line had vanished completely, wiped out by the waves of migration and population change that swept across the continent over thousands of years. She represented the last echo of a ghost population, a group that once thrived in southern China before fading into extinction. This alone was a remarkable discovery, but the real shock came when the team turned to her nuclear DNA, the main genetic code inherited from both parents. They compared her genome against samples from populations across the entire planet, both ancient remains and living groups. They ran analysis after analysis, searching for connections, following genetic trails that stretched back tens of thousands of years. And then they found it. Mengzi Ren shared a direct and unmistakable genetic link with the ancient ancestors of Native American peoples. Her DNA matched a population known as Paleo-Siberians, the groups who lived in the far north of Asia and eventually crossed into the Americas during the last ice age. The same genetic signature that flowed through her veins now runs through indigenous communities from Alaska to the Amazon. Modern Native American groups carry between 9 and 15% of their total DNA from this ancestral source. And there in the cave in Yunnan stood a woman who belonged to that same root population, separated by 7,000 miles and 14,000 years from the people who would eventually carry her bloodline into a new world. The implications were staggering. This woman had never left southern China. She had spent her life gathering food in these forests, cooking red deer over fires, and eventually dying in her 20s or 30s without ever knowing that her distant relatives would one day cross frozen landscapes and populate 2 entire continents. Yet her DNA connected her to one of the greatest migrations in human history. The question was no longer what she was. The question was how this connection could possibly exist. The world beneath the ice. To understand how a woman in southern China could share ancestry with the first Americans, you have to travel back to a world that no longer exists. 14,000 years ago, Earth looked completely different. Massive ice sheets covered much of North America and northern Europe. So much water was locked up in these glaciers that sea levels dropped hundreds of feet below where they stand today. Coastlines extended far beyond their current positions. Islands that are now separated by ocean were connected by dry land. And in the far north, between Siberia and Alaska, a vast stretch of territory rose above the waves. This land is called Beringia, and it was not a narrow bridge, but an entire subcontinent. Grasslands stretched for hundreds of miles, supporting herds of mammoths, horses, and bison. The region could sustain large human populations, and around 25,000 years ago, people began moving into it from both directions. Groups from Siberia pushed eastward. Groups from further south in East Asia pushed northward. They met in this frozen world and began to merge, their bloodlines mixing over generations as they hunted the same animals and survived the same brutal winters. But then the ice trapped them. Glaciers expanded and blocked the routes back into Asia. Massive frozen walls in Canada blocked the routes into the Americas. For roughly 10,000 years, these people remained isolated in Beringia, unable to move in any direction. 10,000 years. That is longer than all of recorded human history. During that immense span of time, the population developed its own unique genetic signature, a blend of northern and southern East Asian ancestry that existed nowhere else on Earth. When the ice finally retreated and passages opened into the Americas, the descendants of this isolated population poured through. They spread down the coastlines, through the interior valleys, across the plains, and into the forests. Within a few thousand years, they had reached the southern tip of South America. Mengzi Ren never made that journey. She belonged to a population that stayed behind, that remained in southern China while her distant cousins pushed north into Beringia. But they all traced back to the same ancient source. The DNA inside her bones was a window into the population that eventually split, with one branch heading toward the Americas and another remaining in Asia until it eventually disappeared. The 40,000-year trail, Mengzi Ren, was not the only evidence of this deep connection. Another discovery, made thousands of miles away in northern China, supported the same story and pushed the timeline back even further. In 2003, researchers excavated a skeleton from Tianyuan Cave near Beijing. When they managed to extract and sequence the DNA, they found something remarkable. This individual had lived 40,000 years ago, nearly 3 times further back than Mengzi Ren. He had walked the earth when Neanderthals still existed, when giant Ice Age animals roamed across Asia, when modern humans were only beginning to spread into new territories. Yet his DNA showed the same pattern. Tianyuan man contributed ancestry both to later East Asian populations and to the ancestors of Native Americans. This meant the shared genetic heritage between China and the Americas was not a recent development. It was not a strange accident that happened once near the end of the Ice Age. It was an ancient connection that stretched back tens of thousands of years, tracing through generations of coastal populations who lived, migrated, mixed, and eventually split into groups that would populate opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean. Together, Mengzi Ren and Tianyuan man formed 2 points on a timeline that revealed the true scope of this story. The ancestral population that would eventually reach the Americas had been spreading across China for at least 40,000 years. Some branches moved north, entering Siberia and eventually Beringia. Other branches stayed in the south, surviving for thousands of years before disappearing under waves of later migration. The woman in Red Deer Cave represented one of the last survivors of that southern branch, a final glimpse of a population that had otherwise vanished from the earth. Unresolved mysteries of human migration.
China, researchers say they found the skull of what they believe is a new species of human.
The Beringian land bridge theory explains most of the evidence, but science is never as clean as textbooks make it seem. For every answer these discoveries provide, new questions emerge from the shadows. Some of these questions have haunted researchers for decades, refusing to fit neatly into any accepted model. And the more scientists dig into ancient DNA, the more they realize that the story of how humans reached the Americas contains chapters that have not yet been written. One of the strangest mysteries involves a genetic lineage called haplogroup X. This maternal line appears in about 3% of Native American populations, particularly among groups living around the Great Lakes region. At first glance, 3% might seem insignificant, a statistical footnote in a much larger story. But when researchers traced the origins of haplogroup X, they ran into a wall that nobody expected. The other major Native American haplogroups, the ones carried by the vast majority of indigenous peoples, match East Asian origins perfectly. They fit the Beringian model without any problems. Haplogroup X does not. Its closest genetic relatives appear not in East Asia but in the Middle East and parts of Europe. The lineage shows up in populations around the Mediterranean, in isolated communities scattered across Western Eurasia, in places that have no obvious connection to the frozen north or the land bridge that supposedly carried all Native American ancestors into the New World. How did a genetic signature from that region end up in Native American communities thousands of years ago? The standard Beringian route does not explain it. If all Native Americans descended from groups who crossed from Siberia into Alaska, then every major lineage should trace back to East Asian sources. Haplogroup X breaks that pattern completely. Some researchers have proposed that an undiscovered Siberian population once existed, a group that carried genetic connections to both Eastern and Western Eurasia before disappearing without leaving any other trace. This ghost population would have joined the migration into Beringia, contributing haplogroup X to the ancestral Native American gene pool before vanishing from Asia entirely. The theory is elegant, but it relies on a population that has never been found. No skeletons, no archaeological sites, no direct evidence that such a group ever existed. Others have proposed far more dramatic explanations. One controversial hypothesis suggests that ancient groups from Europe traveled across the Atlantic Ocean by following the edge of the ice sheets in simple skin boats. During the last ice age, glaciers extended far out into the North Atlantic, creating a frozen highway that theoretically could have been followed from Europe to North America. Supporters of this idea point to similarities between stone tools found in eastern North America and those made by the Solitrean culture of Ice Age Europe. They argue that skilled hunters could have moved along the ice edge, hunting seals and fish, hopping from berg to berg until they reached the other side. Most scientists consider this hypothesis unlikely. The journey would have been extraordinarily dangerous, requiring survival skills and navigation abilities that may not have existed at the time. The ocean crossings involved would have stretched hundreds of miles across frigid, unpredictable waters, and the tool similarities could easily be coincidental, the result of different groups independently developing similar solutions to similar problems, yet the presence of haplogroup X continues to challenge simple explanations. Until someone finds direct evidence of how that lineage reached the Americas, the mystery remains open. The Pacific Ocean itself raises additional questions that nobody has fully answered. For most of recorded history, people viewed this vast expanse of water as an impassable barrier, a wall of waves separating worlds that could never touch. But the Polynesians proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. These master navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using nothing but the stars, the waves, and the flight patterns of birds. They read subtle changes in watercolor, felt shifts in current through their hulls, and followed cloud formations that hinted at islands beyond the horizon. They reached Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand centuries before European ships appeared on the Pacific. Their achievements stand as some of the most impressive feats of navigation and survival in human history. And here is what makes this relevant to our story. There is solid, undeniable evidence that Polynesians reached South America at least once. The proof comes from a simple plant. The sweet potato is native to the Andes Mountains, grown by indigenous South American peoples for thousands of years. Yet when European explorers first reached remote Polynesian islands, they found sweet potatoes already growing there. How did a South American crop end up on islands thousands of miles across the Pacific? DNA analysis of ancient sweet potato samples confirms what many suspected. Polynesians sailed all the way to South America, collected the plant, and carried it back across the ocean sometime before the year 1200. This was not legend or speculation. This was proven genetic fact. If ocean crossings were possible in relatively recent times, could they have happened earlier? Could ancient coastal populations have used simple boats to move along shorelines, following currents that eventually carried them across vast distances they never intended to travel? Could storms have swept fishing vessels out to sea, depositing survivors on distant shores where they mixed with local populations? These questions remain open because the evidence that could answer them lies underwater. Coastal sites from the Ice Age are now submerged, buried beneath hundreds of feet of ocean that rose when the glaciers melted. Whatever camps, boats, tools, or remains those early travelers left behind are hidden on drowned continental shelves that modern archaeology has barely begun to explore. The technology to systematically investigate these underwater landscapes is only now being developed. Until we can search those hidden places, some chapters of this story will remain unwritten, waiting beneath the waves for someone to finally read them. What one skeleton revealed. The discovery of Mengzi Ren did more than answer a 30-year-old question about one unusual skull. It illuminated an entire chapter of human history that had been invisible until now. For decades, the story of how humans reached the Americas was presented as a simple journey across a land bridge. One group of hunters followed animals into a new world and spread across 2 continents. The reality turns out to be far more complex. The ancestors of Native Americans were not a single homogeneous group. They were a mixture of populations from different parts of Asia, blended together during thousands of years of isolation in Beringia. Some of their ancestors came from the frozen north of Siberia. Others traced their lineage to the warm coastal forests of southern China. Mengzi Ren belonged to that southern branch, a population that contributed part of its genetic heritage to the Great Migration before eventually fading away. Her DNA survived not in Asia, but in the Americas, carried across oceans and continents by descendants who never knew she existed. This reframes our understanding of human diversity. The people who first entered the Americas were already a mixed population, carrying genetic heritage from multiple source groups. The variation within Native American communities today reflects that ancient complexity. It is not a story of one migration, but of many streams flowing together, separating and flowing together again over tens of thousands of years. Think about what this truly reveals. A single life, buried in a cave, quietly rewriting the story of an entire hemisphere. For 14,000 years, her DNA waited while borders hardened, histories were simplified, and humanity convinced itself it knew where it came from. Now those assumptions are unraveling. As new genomes are decoded and forgotten pathways re-emerge, one truth becomes unavoidable. Our past is far more connected and far less settled than we were taught to believe. This discovery is not a conclusion. It's a warning that the map of human history is still incomplete. And as scientists prepare to open the next ancient grave, the real question isn't what they'll find, but how many other stories are still buried, waiting to change who we think we are.